A few years ago, there was a school from Conway, South Carolina that took over the college football world. In one of the weirdest seasons in college football history in 2020, Coastal Carolina came out of literally nowhere. Jamie Chadwell was a huge coaching name, Grayson McCall was a quarterback sensation, and the Chanticleers were absolutely awesome. They had a perfect 11-0 season, had one of the most iconic matchups of the 2020 season against BYU, and went from a program that no one knew about to the top of the college football world. In today's video, we're going to talk about the time Coastal Carolina took over college football. We're going to go through the backstory of the program, how they ended up being so good in 2020, and what has happened to them ever since. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about Coastal Carolina football. In order to understand how Coastal Carolina got to this point, we first need to go back in time. The Chanticleers have one of the most interesting histories in college football, as CCU is a very young university, having been founded in 1954 as a junior college. Eventually they would join the South Carolina University system, and have since grown substantially in the last few decades. They were not in any way, shape, or form ready to start a football program until the 1990s finally rolled around. Their first season of organized football took place in 2003, and they were a member of the Big South Conference. They hit the ground running pretty much immediately, going 10-1 in their second season of existence, and making the playoffs back in 2006. They had some interesting players come through their program, especially including quarterback Tyler Thigpen. I did a video on him recently if you want to check it out. But they'd end up slumping for a few years and would hover around 500 after that. They then would fire their head coach, and then they would bring in someone else in 2011. The guy who was fired was David Bennett, and if you remember him, he was sort of crazy, as he was famous on the internet, as he famously had that speech where he said he wanted dogs instead of cats on his team. That was interesting. The guy they brought in to replace him was Joe Moglia. He had a really interesting story because he was a billionaire and had been the CEO of TD Ameritrade before he became the head coach. His stop before Coastal Carolina was the Omaha Nighthawks of another minor league for football, and the craziest thing was that he was actually a good football coach. Under him from 2012 to 2016, the Chanticleers went 51-15 and made the playoffs 4 times, reaching the quarterfinal twice. During his coaching tenure, Coastal got big enough as a school to move all the way up to the FBS, which they elected to do in 2017, eventually joining the Sun Belt. Around that same time, he would start to split his head coaching duties with offensive coordinator Jamie Chadwell. Eventually, Joe retired from football in 2019, leaving Jamie as their new head coach. In his retirement letter, Coach said, quote, "By the time the 2021 season rolls around, we will have recruited 5 years of FBS talent, and we should be expected to be very competitive week in and week out. While my contract continues through the next 2 seasons, I believe that it is truly in the best interest of our program for Coach Chadwell to have the responsibility so that he and the staff can focus on the next 2 years and be ready to go in the future. We all believe the future is bright for Coastal Carolina football, and we also have tremendous confidence in Coach Chadwell as well as the rest of the staff." No one was honestly prepared for how right he could be. Obviously, going into 2020, it was really hard to predict how good any team was going to be, as everything going on in the world made it super chaotic and no one really knew what was going on. Players could be in or out at pretty much any time during any week, and the problem had extended to the Sun Belt and their teams as well. But to be honest, Coastal was not really looking like much of a threat in the Sun Belt that year, given they had been one of the youngest teams in football over the last few seasons. Most of the conversation for the 2020 season surrounded both Louisiana and Appalachian State, as Louisiana was in their heyday with Billy Napier, and Appalachian State had just sent both Scott Satterfield and Elijah Drinkwitz to Power 5 jobs. In fact, The Athletic projected Coastal to finish last in the East Division. They wrote, quote, "The defensive backfield has a lot of questions. Getting to the postseason, whatever that looks like, would be an important step for the program." Bryce Carpenter was the only quarterback listed on the projection, given that Grayson McCall was just a redshirt freshman and no one really cared about him. There was a lot of hype given towards the defense, but Chadwell's spread option style of offense had not worked at the FBS level yet, and the Chanticleers spent 2018 and 19 on the outside looking in, as they went 5-7 both years. So now we get to the actual season itself. The season started off with a victory against Kansas and Lawrence. This was the second straight year they had actually beaten the Jayhawks, and this was absolutely ridiculous, and then they followed that up with a home victory against the FCS Campbell Fighting Camels. They would play their first Sun Belt Conference game just 5 days later, and that would come against the Arkansas State Red Wolves. They ended up winning the game 52-23, and by this point, it was apparent that the Chanticleer offense was something else entirely. They were putting up a ton of points per game, and a lot of that was due to their freshman quarterback Grayson McCall. From there, 11 days would pass before their next game against number 21 Louisiana, the team who was projected to win the Sun Belt. Coastal would beat them 30-27, and this was huge. They were good enough to be ranked, and they would enter the top 25 as the 25th best team in the nation. They then beat Georgia Southern by 2 touchdowns and followed it up the next week by blanking Georgia State 51-0. By the time they had played South Alabama, they were ranked number 15 in the country, and they beat the Jaguars 23-6. 2 weeks would pass before they would play Appalachian State, and they'd win that game 34-23. Despite winning, they fell down in the rankings back to 20th for the game against Texas State, and they won 49-14. The college football world was in a weird place in 2020 though. Teams could get so many players having to miss time that they were unable to play in a game, and this was the case for their game scheduled between them and Liberty. This was supposed to be played as the final regular season game, and it was already December and near the end of the college football season. But the weird scheduling also let a few weird teams get really high in the rankings, and one of those teams was a Zach Wilson-led BYU Cougars. They were still independents in 2020 at the time, and Liberty had to pull out of the game against Coastal because of how many players opted out, meaning they just weren't going to be able to show up. Since BYU was an independent and they were available to play that week, them and Coastal decided to pencil each other in like Little League teams and play each other at the last minute. Due to its kind of crazy story and sheer difference in culture between Coastal and BYU, the game got a lot of hype and earned the nickname Mormons vs. Mullets. Coastal ended up winning at the last second by stopping BYU in the goal line, and they would stay undefeated. The season would now move into December, and Coastal would beat Troy 42-38 in the closest game they had had in Sun Belt competition. They ranked number 13 in the country and were the best team in the Sun Belt. They were then slated to play Louisiana again, who had the best record in the Sun Belt West, but more issues took over and that game was canceled. With Coastal being forced to share the conference championship with Louisiana because of it, they would end up finishing the season undefeated and ranked number 12 in the country. Coastal was not picked for a New Year's Six bowl game though, and were instead, weirdly enough, picked to play against Liberty in the Cure Bowl. That game that was canceled would end up being played at a later time and for a trophy, and after a closely fought game, Coastal would suffer their only loss of the season, losing 34-37 in overtime against the Flames. It was a huge year, and it was honestly a lot of fun to watch. So what has happened to Coastal since then? Despite not going to a New Year's Six bowl or even winning the bowl game they went to, the 2020 Coastal Carolina team ended up having a huge impact on college football and college sports in general. The Sun Belt's image was raised almost immediately, to the point that when the American Conference took teams from Conference USA, this was in no small part due to Coastal Carolina in my opinion. Its nickname of the Fun Belt came onto its own, and now it's one of the premier Group of 5 conferences in the country. It also helped launch the careers of a couple big names. Jamie Chadwell would spend a little bit more time before he became the head coach at Liberty and could be on his way to a Power 5 job soon, and then Grayson McCall has become the best quarterback in school history and is currently at NC State, and then a couple of their skill players ended up making it to the NFL. Grayson had such a huge boost in popularity during that season that he actually started his own line of merchandise and was considered a legitimate Heisman contender in the middle of the year, but he ended up finishing outside the top 10 in votes. Javon Halai was a practice squad player for the NFL for a few years, and Isaiah Likely was drafted by the Ravens in the 4th round of the 2022 NFL Draft. CJ Marable was also a lot of fun and found his way onto an NFL roster. The Chanticleers were able to keep the hype going to the next season in 2021, where they went 11-2 with losses to Appalachian State and Georgia State. They were able to win the Sun Belt once again, and since both of their losses were in the East Division, this would keep them out of the conference championship game, but they would win the Cure Bowl against Northern Illinois at the end of the year. After that, opposing teams started to diagnose their spread option, and their record tumbled a bit. They went 9-4 in 2022 and won the East but lost the championship game to Troy. Jamie Chadwell became one of the top names in the coaching carousel, as I said, but he did stick with the Chanticleers until 2023, where eventually he went to go to Liberty after Hugh Freeze left for Auburn. This one really hurt Chanticleer fans because Liberty had started to really become their rival since 2020. They had some testy games before, but that 2020 season was really the start of a game that became closer to a real rivalry. Coach Chadwell took the majority of the coaches with them, and Coastal would have to find a new head coach. They ended up finding it in an offensive coordinator, Tim Beck, who went 8-5 in year 1 in 2023. Grayson McCall got hurt and only played in 7 games, so he ended up in the transfer portal and is now at NC State. So honestly, a lot has happened since the 2020 season. Coastal was on top of the world, they were on top of college football pop culture, they played in one of the most iconic games, and one of their players had long-term careers. Sadly, it looks like the Chanticleers are slowly starting to fizzle out, and only time will tell if Tim Beck can get the ship in the right direction. We'll just have to wait and see, but even if Coastal Carolina becomes the worst program in the FBS, they'll always be able to hang their hat on that 2020 season, and it'll be something that college football fans like myself remember for a long, long time. But what do you guys think? If you're a Coastal Carolina fan, what do you think of the program and that season? If you're a college football fan in general, let me know your favorite team and your favorite storyline from that crazy 2020 season, and also be sure to give me another topic I can cover in my next video. Before you go, don't forget to also leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.